Greetings, everyone. Time to begin my Wednesday podcast. Today's topic is on dependent origination, the Paticca Samuppadha Sutta. And the Buddha taught dependent origination in many, many suttas. The Paticca Samuppadha Sutta is the most well-known, perhaps. This is a primary and foundational teaching that has become so misunderstood and misapplied, and when it's read, the directness of the teachings, it's hard to understand from that perspective how it's become so misunderstood. It's understandable from the perspective of adapting the Buddhist teachings to fit different cultural and individual views as it spread over the last 2,600 years, to the point where today, when you say the words dependent origination, you might even be corrected to say, oh, no, it's dependent co-arising, or even to change the word dependent completely to say interdependent or interconnectedness or interbe. Famous teachers uses that phrase, interbe, when he's speaking of dependent origination, but not in a way that is as the Buddha taught. So this is a primary teaching, and it's important to understand this teaching to keep in context everything else that followed. This is what the Buddha awakened to. And the Buddha awakened to a profound understanding of how suffering arises in the world and how it's maintained by wrong views. And that begins with the first line in dependent origination. Before I go, let me just, the Buddha taught that we need a meditation method to deepen concentration so that we can support the refined mindfulness necessary to recognize what he awakened to, and that was ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And that developing wisdom of Four Noble Truths means developing a profound understanding of the interrelationship between the impermanence of all things, anicca, the misunderstanding of self, the anatta, the not-self characteristic, and the resulting dukkha, or disappointing and unsatisfactory experiences that follow from not understanding what constitutes a self within an impermanent environment. The Buddha never declared or defined a self in any way, except as he referred to a self in this independent origination, in the line where it says, craving, clinging and maintaining is a prerequisite for becoming. And in the context of dependent origination, we see that the only choice we have is either to become further ignorant by ignoring Four Noble Truths, or we can, in this moment, incline our minds towards awakening and develop understanding of Four Noble Truths, in which case we'll become awakened human beings. In avoiding not defining the self in any way, the Buddha also refused to answer any questions that would continue to deepen ignorance of the result of ignorance of Four Noble Truths. He would often stand silent or say simply that your question is an inappropriate question. It doesn't lead to the goal of awakening. And he called that appropriately attending or appropriately being mindful of what is to be mindful of, meaning the framework of the Eightfold Path. The Buddha's words from the Majjhima Nikaya: as one attends appropriately in this way, three fetters are abandoned: identity view or wrong views of self rooted in ignorance, doubt. It's interesting that one of the modern Mahayana forms of Buddhism talks about generating doubt, and that doubt is a great thing to have, and we should cultivate doubt. When the Buddha consistently said, you don't want doubt. You want to be able to develop the Eightfold Path, the heart with the Dhamma wholeheartedly, and certainly we can't do that with doubt. And then grasping at precepts and practices, the Buddha concludes that quote, meaning that rituals that are formed to continue to ignore our own ignorance are to be recognized and abandoned as well. And there's certainly a lot of precepts and practices that have been developed and are pointed out as important to developing understanding of what the Buddha taught. And of course, they're all just embellishments and distractions. So the Buddha awakened to the profound understanding that it was ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of suffering. And again, this is a primary and a foundational teaching. It's not necessary to remember each of the causative links. What is most important is to understand that the Buddha awakened to the profound understanding that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths that originate, and maintenance of that ignorance continues ongoing disappointment and ongoing suffering in the world. So this is the dependent origination from the Paticca Samuppadha, just the links of it. It's not the whole sutta. From ignorance as a requisite condition comes fabrications. And that first line right there is important. Fabrications or mental fabrications are assumptions that we make about ourselves in relation to the world that are rooted in ignorance. Here's the first line in this chain of dependencies, stating very clearly that ignorance is the problem, and it's a requisite condition to form mental fabrications, or another word for fabrications might be assumptions. We form assumptions about ourselves that are rooted in wrong views. And so anything that would follow from those assumptions is itself rooted in ignorance. And if given any credence at all, can only further that ignorance. And we do that by creating identities over these views that we've made that are rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. So anything that follows from that can only lead to suffering. And at any point that we are able to recognize and abandon these causative conditions, the whole chain of dependencies falls apart. And another way of saying that is that we develop awakening, profound understanding where there was once ignorance. The next step is from those mental fabrications as a requisite condition comes consciousness. And this is not some grand kind of cosmic consciousness. It's not consciousness with a big C, it's consciousness with a small c. And notice again the importance of context and where this appears in the 12-link chain of dependencies. From ignorance as a requisite condition comes fabrications. We've already created assumptions about who we are in relation to the world rooted in ignorance. From that follows disconsciousness, which is simply ongoing thinking rooted in that initial ignorance. So again, anything that would follow or is supported by that type of conditioned thinking can only further ignorance. And this is why the keeping the Buddha's teachings as originally intended in the context it originally intended is so vital in developing awakening. Any deviance from this path will only lead to further confusion, deluded thinking, and suffering. That's why the Eightfold Path is, the Buddha taught that it is the heartwood of the Dhamma, and it's the only path that he ever taught. And last week I talked about the Nagara Sutta, how the Buddha recognized that for the first time that the Eightfold Path was the path to developing a calm and peaceful mind, a mind of lasting peace and happiness. The next line, from consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. Name and form is often, the Pali wording is namarupa, which simply means we've now created an identity. We've given a name to this form, excuse me. And if you relate this to the five clinging aggregates, the five clinging aggregates are form, feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, and ongoing consciousness rooted in ignorance. The Buddha used the five clinging aggregates to describe the ongoing personal experience of suffering. So attaching ourselves by naming this form as me is creating a sense of, the intention is to create a sense of permanence where permanence cannot prevail. This is the human body, and everything that arises within the human body is all rooted in impermanence. And in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha says that if it is impermanent, how can it constitute a self? Let go of those views that are rooting the self to anything that is permanent and substantial. They're wrong views. They're anatta. The next line is, from name and form as a requisite condition comes the sixth sense base. And notice the verbiage here. These are required. These the progression and the establishment or the further establishment of wrong views is progressive, and those views attach itself in different ways. And this is as a requisite condition, from name and form as a requisite condition, from self-identity as a form, comes the condition now of the sixth sense base that we're now using to reinforce those views. The sixth sense base is our five physical senses, and that sixth sense of consciousness or ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance. So from that perspective, you can easily see how once, let me go back a little bit. This has never been meant to be a creation myth or how beings came into physical birth, although most of the modern applications of dependent origination change it to such an extent that it's used that way. And of course, the Buddha never meant this. He's just describing what results from an initial ignorance. And where that ignorance came from is one of those great questions that we avoid because it has no useful answer. The beginning of right view, the first factor of the Eightfold Path, is accepting that my views at the present time are rooted in ignorance. I don't understand Four Noble Truths. And so it's enough at first to just encounter the Four Noble Truths however we might, hopefully from a well-focused Sangha or a so-called Buddhist teacher that's actually teaching what the Buddha taught. Because within the Four Noble Truths lies everything that the Buddha ever taught. And again, getting back to the importance of context, it's understanding dependent origination and the Buddha's very first teaching on Four Noble Truths, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, that we're able to make skillful use of what the Buddha taught. So from the sixth sense base as a requisite condition comes contact. It makes sense, wouldn't it? That we would have to have some vehicle for contact with the external world as a requisite condition to continue this self-establishment as a permanent fixed physical self. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. Again, it makes sense, but notice in the progression of dependent origination and how this relates to the four foundations of mindfulness, the Anapanasati Sutta, the five clinging aggregates. It comes together in these different links in this chain. And this one is feelings. And remember that the Buddha taught in meditation initially that when feelings arise and thoughts arise, to simply recognize their impermanence, their arising and passing away, and come back to the sensation of breathing. In that way, meditation is directly interrupting the process of dependent origination. And in a very profound, subtle, and powerful way, it is in that way that Shamatha Vipassana meditation deepens concentration and supports the concentration necessary to recognize and abandon the process of dependent origination. From feeling as a requisite condition comes craving. So once I've established myself in this process, rooted in ignorance, and now I've decided through contact with the external world that something gives me pleasure, I will crave for more of that because I've now established a self-referential view based on that craving. Or if something arises that brings me displeasure, then the same type of craving, but now called aversion, is set in motion, and I will do everything I can to avoid that, which might bring me disappointment or displeasure. So when the Buddha describes the nature of suffering, it describes it always consistently in this way. Birth is aging, sickness is aging. Birth is suffering, sickness is suffering, aging is suffering, and death is suffering. Not getting what is desired is suffering. Getting what is not undesired is suffering. And then the Buddha would always conclude that by saying, in short, the five clinging aggregates are suffering. Concluding that statement by saying that what we use to describe ourselves to ourselves is in itself suffering. The views itself are rooted in ignorance. And that's where it's clearly seen in that initial statement of what is dukkha, how does it occur, what is its nature. From craving as a requisite condition comes clinging and maintaining. So that initial craving rooted in wrong views now gives rise to clinging and maintaining these wrong views of self. And we will do, I gave a little talk, I think it was last Saturday, on understanding the profound nature of ignorance and the very powerful but subtle strategies we all employ to continue to ignore our own ignorance. And that's included right here in this point. Remember in the Nagara Sutta, where the Buddha talks about being stuck in the feedback loop of self-identification and thinking rooted in ignorance. And that is the primary problem that we all have. We're stuck in this feedback loop that leads to confusion and deluded thinking and ongoing suffering, that unless something is developed to interrupt that thinking, there's no way we'll be able to recognize that the ongoing deluded thinking. Excuse me. And so you remember what I just said about meditation interrupting the concentration developed in meditation, interrupting that process. And it's right here where you can see that when we can recognize craving or what it gives rise to, clinging and maintaining, and practice restraint, we're developing in that moment great insight into the three marks of existence, great insight into what we've set in motion through our own ignorance, resulting in 12 observable causative links in ongoing suffering. That's directly what dependent origination points to. So let me continue that. Go back one. From craving as a requisite condition comes clinging and maintaining. From clinging and maintaining as a requisite condition comes becoming. And that is probably the singular most important line in all of what the Buddha taught, because it points to the potential of each moment. When we start developing the Eightfold Path as intended, start deepening our concentration to then begin to integrate the Eightfold Path as a framework for our life, then the potential in each moment points towards becoming awakened rather than becoming further ignorant. And in that line where there's no modifier, as a requisite condition comes becoming, and the next line is from becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. The Buddha is not talking about physical birth so much as he's talking about giving birth to another moment rooted in ignorance. And that is the primary and fundamental understanding of what the Buddha taught. And everything hinges on being mindful of life as life occurs, so that we can incline our minds or continue to incline our minds towards awakening based on the framework of the Eightfold Path, rather than continue ongoing thinking and ongoing confusion rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths that would only allow to become further ignorant. And hence the title of my book and the importance of understanding the meaning of becoming. And so that points again to the meaning of what am I going to become in this moment? Because if I can develop a well-concentrated mind and start framing my thinking by the Eightfold Path, then I can continue to incline my mind towards awakening. If I continue to ignore my own ignorance, I can only become more ignorant. And that's just common sense. Common sense. The Buddha concludes this section on dependent origination, describing how the process rooted in ignorance ends in suffering this way. From giving birth as a requisite condition. Now remember, giving birth to ignorance is what's most important here, not as a creation myth, because there's nowhere where the Buddha uses a teaching on dependent origination in any way to establish a creation myth. That's included in the Pali Canon, but it's only included in the Abhidhamma, which if you read my book, you'll understand that the Abhidhamma is not something that the Buddha taught. The Abhidhamma was something that was added at the Second Buddhist Council to allow for more mystical teachings, even within the local Theravadan community. So it's not something that the Buddha taught. And it's only in the Abhidhamma that a very mystical account is attributed to dependent origination, and where it's altered to such a way that it allows as a creation myth. In the Sutta Pitakas, the collection of the Buddha's direct teachings, there's never any mention of any type of creation myth. So from birth as a requisite condition comes aging, sickness, and death, sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair. In short, the whole mass of suffering. And remember how the Buddha describes suffering, and concluding with the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. Again, the ongoing personal experience of suffering. So this primary teaching on dependent origination is foundational for anyone who hopes to develop what the Buddha teaches as a path to awakening, because understanding that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing suffering, then points the mind towards actually developing an understanding of Four Noble Truths. It's surprising to me even today how many years I spent as an active Buddhist in modern Buddhism, studying modern Mahayana Buddhism. And I never once had a teacher that sat me down and taught me dependent origination the way the Buddha taught, that taught me the Four Noble Truths, or actually helped me develop the Eightfold Path and taught me how to integrate the Eightfold Path as the path to awakening. When it's in modern Buddhism, even if the Four Noble Truths are spoken about, they're usually spoken about as an anachronism, something that is almost an inferior teaching, when in fact everything the Buddha taught was in the context of the Four Noble Truths and in the context of dependent origination. So a good way of keeping a skillful focus on our Dhamma practice, whenever we're coming across any teaching that is outside of the Sutta Pitaka, to ask ourselves, does it relate in some way to ending ignorance of Four Noble Truths, and how does it do so? Because in that way, we'll incline our minds back towards the Eightfold Path, because that is the only path that I've ever come across that keeps a mind well focused and avoids the subtle but very powerful distractions that have developed in modern Buddhism that only continue to distract away from what the Buddha taught and what he awakened to, and to continue to ignore our own ignorance. So it is remarkable that after 2,600 years since the Buddha's passing, we still have his teachings available in their pure form. The challenge then is to keep it focused on just what the Buddha taught, because it's enough. The teachings of an awakened human being leading directly to awakening in this lifetime, in this life as our life occurs. And again, it's all rooted in the meditation developed through shamatha vipassana meditation that allows for the framework of the Eightfold Path to be integrated as a path to awakening, and then to understand and keep in mind the primary importance of maintaining the context of everything that the Buddha taught. So that's the end of my talk for today. I hope you found it beneficial. I see there's 3 folks that joined me. Thank you so much for joining me. If you find benefit from this talk, please consider a donation at becoming-buddha.com. And again, thank you for joining me. I hope you can join me again next week. Peace.